A big hello and welcome everyone, and welcome to our webinar today is Consulting Your Next Calling. My name's Christine. I'm going to be hosting today's webinar and supporting today's webinar by managing the chat and collecting questions you pose along the way, grouping them thematically and posing them during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. Also, I want to reassure you that one of our presenters, Susan, will graciously be providing your contact information at the end of the webinar. So if you have any follow-up questions, you're also going to be able to follow up directly with her. It's my pleasure to introduce Susan, Schaefer, and Don Tebbe, who will between them have over 4 decades consulting success serving nonprofits. Susan founded her fundraising consultancy Resource Partners in 2001, and since then she's been on a mission to help other budding consultants bypass the pitfalls of this career path and get on a fast track to success. Susan co-edited the Nonprofit Consulting Playbook and has facilitated workshops on this topic nationwide with Don. And that brings me to Don. After over a decade as a nonprofit executive, Don started his consulting business in 1993 as a solopreneur. And in the early 2000s, he co-founded a firm that he and a business partner built into a 7-figure national practice. He sold his share of the business in 2013 and is pursuing an encore career, helping leaders such as yourselves plot their next career move, including how to succeed as a consultant. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Don.
Thanks, Christine, and welcome everyone. So glad you could join us today. And we'd like to start off by learning a little bit about who's on the call today. And since you're on this webinar, you're probably in one of 3 places. You're either exploring consulting as a business or as a career move, or you're actively planning to launch a consulting practice, or you may have already launched a consulting business, you already have it underway. So to help us get a sense, just type in the chat, exploring if you're just starting to think about it, planning if you're actually planning to launch your practice and it's imminent, or underway if you're already consulting. So just type that in.
Yeah. Lots of answers coming in, lots of exploring, lots of underway, exploring, a few plannings coming in, and just occasionally people who are already consulting. So quite a range, but lots of exploring for sure.
Super, thanks so much. Well, so there's probably, regardless of where you are, the thing that you share in common is curiosity. You're curious about something. You know, if you're exploring or planning, you're probably curious about what it takes to get started. If you've already launched your practice, you're probably curious about whether you're getting off on the right foot, or maybe you're wondering, do these folks have any tips for me to make my practice more successful? In any event, we got you covered on this webinar. And so here's what we're going to cover today. Here's what we're going to cover in the presentation. If we don't, and again, to kind of reiterate what Christine said, if you put your question into the chat, she's going to organize them. Stacy and Christine are going to organize them and make sure that we get to as many as possible in the Q&A session that's going to. And we're going to talk, we're going to go spend about an hour on the presentation and then about half an hour of Q&A. So there's a good chance that we can get to your question. So the topics we're going to cover today, first of all, we're going to talk about the motivations and barriers to starting consulting practice. You know, the motivations are the fuel that drives your organization or your business forward, and barriers obviously are things that you have to confront. And so we want to touch on those a little bit. Want to explore some consulting myths, because there's oftentimes, you know, when we announce to our friends and family that we're going to start a consulting practice, you know, sometimes the eyes roll, the groans begin. And so we want to kind of look at some of those myths and dispel them. We're also going to talk about some success traits that we've seen, that Susan has seen from her research to catalog kind of the best practices of consultants, about 25 consultants around the country, and then from the experience that we've had over the years of training hundreds of associates and other consultants in our training program. We're going to talk about consulting as a career and consulting as a business. We need to take a look at both of those tracks. Because you can't have one without the other. If you can't make a consulting career work unless you go to work for one of the big consulting firms. You can't make it work if you don't pay attention to the business pieces. And so we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about the business of consulting. And we're going to wrap up with a 7-step launch plan and our formula for a successful consulting practice. So got a lot to cover, so we're going to jump right into it. So one of the first things that we have to do is, or one of the things we encourage you to do is to check in with your motivations for starting a consulting practice. You know, when we talk to consultants about why they started their practice, you know, they say different things, but it kind of falls into 3 underlying or overarching reasons. They're looking for freedom, the freedom to set their own schedule, the freedom to kind of call their own shots. You know, maybe they've been called on to be a caregiver and they need that schedule flexibility, or maybe they're retired or approaching retirement and are not ready to, you know, hang up their skates, but really want to kind of have something, keep their hand in the game, but they also want that schedule freedom. The second is contribution. That, you know, I've been an executive, spent a decade as a nonprofit executive, and now 25 years as a consultant. I wouldn't give up my executive experience for anything, but you know, the kind of the satisfaction you get from the contribution that you can make in consulting, to work on so many different missions and to work with so many wonderful folks in the nonprofit world. You know, it's just it's infinitely different than being an executive where you're focusing on a single mission and you're kind of confronting all the same problems every day. It's just incredible, the amount of freedom and contribution that consulting offers. And the third thing, and this is kind of a touchy area here in the nonprofit world, and that's income. The flexibility to you know, approach or to kind of control your own destiny. So we talked a little bit about the freedom to run your own show, to not be pigeonholed inside of an organization. Sometimes we're looking for more work-life balance, and for some of us, it's as simple as a better commute. That's, you know, one of the key reasons why I became a solopreneur again, and so my business, share of the business several years ago, was because boy, the commute to just here in the DC area was just killing me. And, you know, so there's a lot of other reasons. I plus wanted to start this course, but that's another story. Contribution, we talked about the contribution of, oftentimes consulting offers us a bigger platform to work with multiple organizations, to work with multiple missions. It's also an opportunity to spread our wings and try new fields, new approaches. And one of the things I hear from, you know, a lot of consultants, although they may use different terms around this, but they really cherish the opportunity to fully express themselves. That there's just the, you know, they have the freedom to kind of, you know, create their own canvas of a career and create their own canvas of a business. And so contribution is a huge, huge piece of, I think, reason why folks start. And then we talked about income, more control over your economic destiny, an opportunity to increase your income, an opportunity to level up your income with your sense of value that you're creating in the world, and also to build multiple streams of income, which is really kind of important for these kind of uncertain economic times. And finally, to build something of value. It is, in fact, indeed possible to build a practice and sell it to another firm, and so you can build something, you know, can build a little bit of a nest egg there for yourself by building your business. So so we're talking about barriers. Sorry about that, I double-clicked here. So there are barriers to consulting, and we're going to talk about those in a bit, but in fact, let's do this. Christine, why don't we, let me ask you, I'll just type in the comment box, what do you think the #1 barrier to starting consulting practice? Maybe it's your barrier or barrier you've heard tell of. Type it in the chat box.
Finding client time. Finding first clients. Finding lots of clients is coming in a lot. Legal compliance. Lack of confidence, managing time, which I know you guys will talk about, thinking about the income stream, the instability, potentially fees or taxes associated with it, a little bit of fear of the unknown, which I know you'll also speak to, and the legal aspect of it is coming up a few times, and certainly also just fear and uncertainty about going beyond that 9 to 5 mentality. And lastly, I think another theme of just figuring out what your fees should be and how much time you spend.
Yeah, those are all great. Let's say they're challenges to deal with, and certainly there's nothing that I've heard there that's insurmountable. And you're in good company too for almost all of those topics. So, but the number one thing that you hear in the comments and also just hear from consultants is fear. Fear of selling, that they have some sort of bad news idea about selling. There's fears about income stability that goes on, and I've heard that in the chat comments. And then fears about starting a business is going to be overwhelming. There's just so much involved. And so let's talk about those. So the first one, fear of selling. Truth of the matter is, you can't serve it until you sell it. You can't. You don't have the opportunity to make that contribution that we talked about earlier and drive that income without, selling a project. But the good news is that, selling consulting services is not like your nightmare dream about selling. Actually, what we've learned over the years is that the same skills that you develop to be a great consultant will make you great at selling consulting services. That really the best way to sell consulting services is to actually begin the service process. And so I hope that, for those of you that hyperventilate at the idea of selling, there's no cold calling involved. In fact, one of the things that we do in our consulting course is, first of all, to ask you to inventory what we call your strengths portfolio. And one of the things that we look for or ask you to look for is the network of relationships that you have. And, usually most consultants are really astonished by the number of relationships that they have that, when we ask them, can you identify 12 people that would buy your services either immediately or, in the near term future, or 12 people that can get your foot in the door at your target clients, nearly everyone can come up with that list. So, selling consulting services really about drawing on your network then rather than kind of the bad dream used car salesman idea of selling. The second concern usually is around income stability, and it's true that income stability is a fact of life for consultants, but there's ways to manage your practice, particularly in the marketing and selling process, to ensure that you have a pipeline of work. I think the concerns that most consultants, consultants that have the ups and downs, are doing what we call the roller coaster ride. They get so focused on serving a client, and they're excited by the project, and that they don't really they don't feed their sales pipeline, what we call the sales funnel. And it doesn't have to be an elaborate effort, but you just need to keep things stoked. And I think the consultants that seem to have the best experience with income stability are those that are constantly they've figured out their rhythm, and that's one of the things over the years that I'd learned is figure out my marketing rhythm so that I had a flow of projects coming in. So rest assured, there are ways of working around that. And then finally, that the startup is overwhelming. And the fact of the matter is that, for most, in most jurisdictions, maybe a little bit more complicated in cities like New York or, some of the bigger cities where they have, local regulations and local taxes on businesses, there might be a little bit more complicated. But the fact of the matter is, in most states, starting a business is a matter of filling out, a couple forms. Now, there's some work to do preceding that, figuring out what you're going to name your business, and but the actual paperwork usually it really isn't that daunting. So let's talk a little bit about, for those that you are that are planning or you're exploring. Is there anything that's stopping you right now? Any stoplights that you're facing? And let's see if, type them in the comment box, and let's see if we can turn those into green lights as we work through the presentation or the Q&A section. So what's holding you back? Or what stoplights are you facing?
All right, they're coming in. A few first ones have to do with marketing, logo, branding, healthcare options. Health insurance has come up a few times, actually. Not sure if they're ready to quite leave their job yet. Clarity on exactly what they're going to do or what needs they're going to fulfill. And yeah, really practical things like what are the legal startup pieces? What are the marketing pieces? What are the overhead costs? How do you price, especially for nonprofits? And taking the leap to leave a job.
Yeah, those are all really great. Really great. Well, I look forward to digging into those when we get into the Q&A section, if we haven't addressed it already. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to hand it over to Susan for her to pick up to talk about myths. So thanks. Back to you in a little bit here.
Thanks, Don. And we're going to be addressing some of those pieces that are holding you back in this next section on myths, because there are a lot of myths floating around about the consulting career. And those are things that we certainly don't want holding you back, because really, as you'll see, our recurring theme here is that just getting started is the key to overcoming all of these barriers and fears. It's just like anything else in life. So before we give you some specifics on a number of the topics that you just mentioned, let's talk about the things that truly do not need to be as barrier inducing as they may be. So when we talk about myths, this next slide, if I can get it to move. Maybe Don, there we go. This is not a myth, but it gets at one. Strangely, my favorite consulting related quote is a Mark Twain quote that says, "An expert is an ordinary fellow from another town." Think about that. It is a beautiful way to think about consulting. There are so many myths and misconceptions about consultants. Believe it or not, though, we do not have all the answers. Amazing, isn't it? The fact that that a lot of people come into this field thinking that their job is to go in and provide the answers can be, believe it or not, a barrier to them moving forward easily. Sometimes, of course, we do come into a room and have more experience and training on a particular niche topic than others in the room. But more often than not, the notion of being from another town, so to speak, does have a ring of truth to it. Many times the value that we bring as consultants is a fresh perspective and maybe a new way of doing things that our client hasn't thought of. So when someone did mention a minute ago in the barriers that they're not quite sure where to focus their efforts, really one place that we all need to focus our efforts is on the idea of learning how to drive change. We need to learn how to drive change as much as we need to learn about our respective consulting content, because in the end, we're really working often with a very bright group of people who may be having organizational or other types of barriers to getting their jobs done. So just remember, we're in there as a team player, even though we're coming from the outside. I'm for some reason not moving these slides well. So Don, maybe you'll be able to forward for me, thanks. Consulting myths, we're gonna look at some other myths, and if you like, you can enter some of the ones you might perceive in the chat box. I'll move forward and see if there are any others that come in at the end that we haven't addressed. But for now, we'll advance to the first one and say that some of you got at this in your comments a moment ago, that it takes a lot of money to make this field happen, to make this career change happen. And Don alluded to this in his comment about startups. It takes surprisingly little money to get a service business started these days. the fees associated with registering your business are relatively minimal. If you haven't started looking into it yet, you'd be surprised that a few $100s can get you well on your way to getting the paperwork done that you need to move your business forward, depending on its complexity. And you may decide to start off simply and then potentially go for a more complex structure later, but that's not even a necessity. I've always kept things simple and have loved it that way. Honestly, if you have a laptop and a phone at this point, you are well on your way. So what you do need really is some cash in the bank while you get your first clients in the door, because you can imagine that not only does it take some time in some cases to get clients, but it also then takes time for those clients to maybe come forward and pay you, unless you create a contracting structure where you're getting a first payment up front. Many consultants do that to even out their path. But again, in terms of just getting started, it really doesn't take a lot of money that you need to lay out to move things forward. On the next slide, you'll see that, again, we go back to the startup paperwork, which does seem daunting to many people. But I can't tell you in these workshops we've done around the country and other talks I've given, how many people have told me that the paperwork was their barrier to getting their business up and running. And in many of those cases, to be honest, they hadn't really looked at what needed to be done yet. Depending on the structure your business takes, the process can be surprisingly simple, as in a few forms, really, to get things started. So please don't let that stop you. What turns out in this case to be far more time consuming and complex is the process of determining your messaging and how the word will get out about your business. So all of these pieces that Don has begun to allude to, and a few of you also said marketing, we're going to talk about that before the end of the hour. But those early pieces about figuring out your own best services and strengths, those are the pieces that surprisingly become a little more daunting often than the paperwork. So this is really not a place to let things hold you up. Another myth that's really important, a lot of you mentioned fees in your comments. The myth that you must lower your fees to get business. Let me begin by saying there are plenty of consultants I know who have charged less than they wanted to when their business was new. That does work for some people, especially because, let's all face it, our confidence in this new line of work may not yet be solidified. But beware, when you begin with lower fees, it can make things more difficult if you want to raise them later, especially if you plan to raise them significantly. In particular, if you have a business model where you might work with a client repeatedly, or if you work with them over, let's say you've got a year or even 2-year long contract, it can be very difficult to raise fees with that same client. And one consultant I know who works in a smaller geographic market found that her fees as a new consultant, they were getting around very quickly among potential clients via word of mouth. So it was harder for her to raise her fees because many in her area knew them already and balked when she later tried to raise them. So, nothing is a given, but it's really important in this field. Things can constantly present barriers for you. And so it's really important to just take a deep breath and do some research in advance, and then go out there and present your best self, including your best presentation of fees. Don't feel pressured to lower your fees just because you're new. It's really they're based on your expertise and your reputation. Your fees reflect those, not your years as a consultant. So if you've spent years as an executive, then great. That's really that's your gold, is the idea that you've had a long work history and have a stellar reputation. Finally, on this, it's worth saying that the best clients, in my experience, they are shopping by looking at your experience and reputation and how well they might be able to trust you. They are not shopping around fees. Frankly, clients who look at fees first tend not to make the best clients. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, moving on to the next one. The next two are a bit complementary. The fact that you must work long hours. Some people come into this thinking, my gosh, I'm going to be working 24/7. Let me just say that when I began consulting, I had one infant, and then shortly after that, I had a toddler. It felt like I was consulting 80 hours a week, but really it was only about 30. It's what that time of life feels like, I think. But you know how many people knew about that schedule of mine? Only me. No, none of my clients knew or frankly cared how much I was working. I'll give you another example. There's a consultant I know who's been incredibly successful over many decades, and he works from 9 to 5, period. He doesn't answer his phone before or after that. He doesn't take his laptop home with him at night. So that is the beauty of this field. You are really able to do what you want to do. I've been working now full-time and more than full-time for plenty of years, but I've made it a goal of mine to find the most efficient ways to spend my days. So my income many years is stable or rising, but the hours that I'm spending have declined or stayed equal. So it's really about finding the right business model that will give you the income that you need and want, and the hours that will make that happen. So it's the beauty of this field. It's a choice, and it works very well for most of us. The corollary to that is that another myth is that you might work less but earn more. So I just admitted that I found a way to work less and earn the same or more, but it did take many years of work to find the right model, the right business model to get to that point. That's something that can really take time to hone. Don't expect that an immediate result of your new consulting career will be that you will suddenly be working that much less and earning more. You'll need to spend much of your early days doing marketing and securing clients, and unfortunately, those hours are unbillable. For years, I did tinker with different business models. One included more hand-holding of clients. Another included working on more detailed reports. Other engagements were drawn out because I'd spend so much time trying to micromanage the progress that my clients were making. But let me be the first to say that in those early years, I certainly didn't work less, but I did earn about what I earned in-house. So those are the hard lessons that we learn oftentimes early on, and part of the reason Don and I have decided to do workshops like this and the ones we've worked on with the Foundation Center is that I personally had vowed one day to help more people be able to figure out the formulas that you can use to get yourself into a more efficient place more quickly. Okay, and finally, following a guru's path to success. I don't know about you, but I couldn't wait to run to some of my more respected consultants when I started out and ask for a download of all the information that made them successful. I learned so much from them, and then I couldn't wait to run back to my office, start implementing it myself. And then I have to admit, it didn't always feel right. So what I learned the hard way, and again, I hope this is a takeaway for some of you who haven't launched your practices yet, is that it's really important to pick and choose who you listen to on which issues, because your practice will be most successful when you are your authentic self. When Don talked earlier about the fear of selling, I certainly had that myself. And I have to say, it's being true to yourself that makes you successful, both as a consultant and as someone who sells consulting services. So I'll just wrap this section up by saying there are many paths to success in this career path. It's fabulous for that reason. So they include your scope of work, your ideal clients, obviously the marketing vehicles. You can make different choices in all of these areas and the ones that we're about to touch on next, and still have a very successful practice. We walk participants, by the way, through all of these pieces in workshops we offer. It's so powerful to watch people, no matter how you decide to learn as you go on, if it's reading or talking to people or taking workshops, it can be really exciting to figure out which elements of a business work best for you and what really speaks to the way you want to run your practice. So now as you begin your own consulting journey, what exactly does that career path look like? What will your days look like on a regular basis? I'm going to turn it over to Don now to tell you a little bit about that.
Great, thanks, Susan. So we're going to talk about the success traits first of all. So, and just before we get into that, I also just want to mention that for those of you that stick around to the end of the webinar, we've got a gift for you that is a online or an assessment that you can download and take. It's something that we've worked on over the recent months to really kind of catalog some of what are the critical factors that you need to have in place to have a successful consulting practice? What do you need to bring into it? What are the things that you need to learn? I think that's a good segue for this discussion here about traits, because one of the things we've learned is that the most successful consultants seem to be authentically themselves. They use their authentic self when they're selling, and that oftentimes attracts clients that are in sync with them and their personality, their approach to the world, their outlook, so forth. So I think that's one of the things that we would suggest first of all is really to not assume that you need to kind of remold yourself to be like the guru that Susan talked about, or whatever guru you think out there, or somebody that you know that's a successful consultant. But it's about finding your own path. And so one of the things that we've learned over the years about successful consultants, first of all, has to do with endurance. In fact, several years ago, somebody asked me, "What's the secret to success in consulting?" I said, "Keep standing. Just keep standing. That if you keep standing long enough, it's people will find you. And if you do good work, people will find you." And so I think that's a big part of it, is just really being in this business for the long haul. The second area is grace under pressure. And this is one of the things that I think really surprised me as over the years in my consulting practice, because I think Christine asked me a question the other day as we were planning the webinar. She said, "Well, what's the one piece of advice that you would give to consultants?" And I said, "Don't assume that your technical skills or your content knowledge and your knowledge of the nonprofit sector is going to be enough to have a successful practice. That it really does take some business skills. It takes some skills to translate that technical knowledge and that content knowledge into consulting services." And the thing that surprised me most about consulting services, that oftentimes we think that the value of our advice or the brilliance of our plans is really what's going to win the day with clients. And you know what I've learned over the years is demeanor, our approach to the client, what I call our consulting presence, is a huge. It dwarfs, obviously you need to have decent advice, and good plans and so forth. You got to be able to do good content work with a client, but you can do good content work and still not have a successful business if you're not approaching clients in the right way. And I think that's one of the things that really surprised me, is that oftentimes when we're working with clients, we get to a level of trust where they kind of open up and get vulnerable with us, and you got to be able to kind of live with that and work with that, and be kind of that rock sometimes when a client is going through some emotional circumstances. So having that grace under pressure, I think, is and oftentimes clients rarely call us because everything is going smashingly. They often call us because they've got a problem or an issue or something that they need to address. And so oftentimes underneath the surface can be some really strong emotional currents, and you got to be able to work with that. Flexibility, I think that's one of the things that I've learned over the years, that I'm a kind of a tool and systems geek. and I needed to learn to temper that because that wasn't getting me forward. It wasn't advancing my business. That you really need to almost be adaptable and adapt to your clients' values and outlook and situation and so forth, or at least the circumstances that they're dealing with, and really be present to that rather than kind of bringing in your tried and true toolkit. People don't want cookie cutter, even though you can have what I call solution stacks. You got, if you go to a mechanic, they don't, to fix your car, they don't go back out back and forge a new wrench. They reach in the toolbox. But but clients really don't want that kind of cookie cutter approach. You got to be able to put approaches together that really feel customized to their particular needs and circumstances. Talking about risk taking, it's a kind of a cliche that you need, you got to be a risk taker to start a business. I don't know about that. I mean, yeah, I suppose that there's some, but one of the things in risk that really surprised me was the whole trust building process. And there's a different kind of risk at work there, and that's the risk of getting vulnerable with a client. And clients rarely take the initiative to open up to you. You almost have to, you have to first of all create that opening for them, that that you really are someone that is going to be the rock, your trusted presence in their life, and really to get a little bit vulnerable with them before they will get vulnerable with you. But that's that building that trusting relationship, those high trust relationships. That's what's going to win you fans. That's what's going to win you repeat business. It's not the mechanics of consulting, and it's not the brilliance of your plans. Yes, you have to do good work, but how you are with clients and how you are with people is a critical component of success. And being, putting yourself at risk to be vulnerable with a client is important. And that sort of ties into the idea of listening and communications. That I think that's probably the number one skill that every consultant needs to work on. I've just been astonished over the years that it seems like every time I invested in some sort of personal development program that touched on that area, I could see a jump in my business and my business satisfaction. And particularly listening. One of the things I learned over the years is that the more you let the client talk, the more brilliant you seem. And so I think that's working on your listening skills is an important element of an important success rate. And then finally, resilience. There's different kinds of resilience here. The physical, sometimes sometimes, we talked earlier about kind of the freedom that you have in your schedule, but the reality is sometimes projects are going to dictate your schedule. Like right now, Susan and I are working to take this course online, and I'm working like 80 hours a week, recording things and putting all the lesson plans together and so forth. But that's what needs to happen right now. And the beauty is that I'll be able to take some time off this summer. But you've got to be able to have the physical stamina to work the hours when the hours are there. But I think the other piece of resilience is also the financial resilience. Having that in one of the things that we talk about in our course is that profit isn't a dirty word, that you do need profits. You just don't focus on what you need to cover your income. You also need to, what we suggest is focusing on profit first. And profit's not necessarily a dirty word. You need to build up a financial cushion so that you can smooth out your cash flow, so forth. So financial resilience, I think, is another piece of the puzzle. So let's talk a little bit about the, I'll tell you what, before we do that, let me ask you, do you think that there's a success trait that we've missed? You've worked with consultants or successful people, and our business people out there. That is there a trait that you think we missed? Go ahead, type that in the chat box.
Storytelling came in from Daniel. Writing and marketing, a sense of humor, curiosity, a few on charisma, communication, integrity, patience, focus. So a lot of kind of personality traits and honing that communication skills, being trustworthy, being able to promote yourself, and pairing that with writing often are a few of the themes coming in on the chat.
Great, great. Well, we got a brilliant group here today. Those are all wonderful. And you know, truth of the matter is, Susan told me I could only have 6 pictures up here, so I need to pare the list down. Well, not in this particular course, but in the online course we're working on. So let's talk about employment life versus consulting life and some of the elements there. So one of the things that we talked about earlier is the whole idea of contribution and the opportunity to work on you know, multiple missions. There is a downside to that piece, in that you know, the good news is that, you know, when you're helping a client address a change in their organization, the good news is that you aren't necessarily the one that's going to have to, you know, implement that. You know, you get to, you know, plan with a client, and they're going to take, you know, pick up responsibility for, you know, implementing, guiding that change. But the bad news about that is oftentimes you don't get the, you know, you don't get to see the result. You don't get to see the satisfaction. But, you know, there are ways around that, and that's staying in touch. Really, what we talk about in the course is don't focus on having a client base, focus on having a fan base. That you have clients that you've, you know, developed deep relationships with, that they really respect you. They're, you know, in your fan base. They're eager to talk about, eager to give you referrals. And so I think that's one way of staying, you know, staying in touch. But it's not like being inside the organization and having those victory celebrations when, you know, something's going really well. So there's pluses and minuses to that aspect of consulting. Let's talk about bosses. You know, sometimes we, you know, think that we're going to go into consulting and be our own boss, but the reality is that the more clients you have, the more bosses you have. The good news is, though, that that relationship with those bosses tends to be significantly different than an in-house boss. You know, it's usually much more of a collegial kind of relationship. But the reality is that you've got to, you know, you got to adapt to that, to each one of your clients. I remember I was writing a book back in the 90s, doing some research on consulting, or on board governance practices and highly effective nonprofits, and I was interviewing this really highly respected leader in San Jose, California, and I was asking her about her relationship with her board chair. She said, "Well, I think of myself as getting married every 2 years when I get a new board chair," and that always kind of stuck with me. I think that's a kind of you know, almost the kind of attitude that you need to have with clients, that you really, you are going to invest in this relationship, and you know, but you also need to be able to adapt to it, because like one of my clients is a head of a university. He was like a #2 guy in one of the branches of the military, and he has a very different bearing than you know, one of my other clients, who is a you know, former social worker, and so the kind of the way to relate to them is dramatically different, but the thing that they share in common is that they are interested in results. So I think that's one of the important things, is being, you know, we talked about that flexibility earlier, or adaptability. That's part of it, is really adapting yourself to the client's circumstances and situation and outlook. One of the things that surprised me too is just the challenges of teamwork when you're consulting, when you're not in charge. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to be leading teams. The leadership is going to be different, but you know, I think that's really one of the things that really struck me, is just the, you know, I assumed I was going to be doing a lot of independent work, you know, calling my own shots, that sort of thing, and I was really struck by, you know, how much, you know, of consulting work really involves being able to, you know, quickly get in, form, you know, team with your client and your client's people, sort out the landscape, sort out the, you know, yes, there's the power structure, but what's the informal power structure in this organization? Get that sorted out, and really be able to work effectively with a group of people, and I'd almost call it an ensemble around a project, and then the project's over. And so you really, I think the thing that really just struck me so much was just the power of teamwork in the consulting setting, and then really being able to get in, adapt, learn, work with folks, help them find their own path forward, and then obviously at a certain point you need to disengage. So it's a rich experience, but it's also sometimes it's bittersweet because you don't get to stick around for kind of those good social rewards for the long term. So we talked earlier about stable paychecks versus variable income. I'm not sure there's much more to say about that. It is a fact of life, and I mentioned in the comments about resilience that you do need some profits to be able to plan for the slow times. But I think one of the things that really struck me, particularly weathering the 2008 recession, was I was with Transition Guides at the time. We didn't lay anybody off, any of our staff members off, but it was some nail-biting times. But the thing that really struck me about that experience was was the resilience that we built up by having a really good, strong client base, and so we had a continuous flow of business. It wasn't as robust as before or after the recession, but we certainly had business coming in. So I think that's another way of kind of building your client base, building your fan base. So it's another kind of investment, emotional bank account kind of investment that's going to pay off when the slow times. We talked about rigid schedules versus flexible schedules. I'm not sure there's much more to say about that, but that's one of the benefits or one of the perks of consulting is that flexible schedule. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about kind of where you might find yourself working as a consultant, or where you might find yourself spending your time. And really got kind of 4 areas that consultants typically will, your day revolves around. In fact, my calendar, I do time blocking, and I've got my time blocked out around this, including some time for that I call create, which is time for writing and creating content and so forth. But hopefully, the bulk of your time might be, devoted to the box of serving clients, and you might get there eventually. When you're starting out, it's probably going to be a little bit smaller than when it is. There's something we call the billable hours factor that we talk about in the course, and it's really identifying how many billable hours, possible billable hours, do you have in a year to devote. And every time we take somebody through that exercise, it seems like they're always surprised by, the amount of time that you really do need to devote to administration and marketing. And a 4th area that oftentimes gets overlooked is continuing education. One of the things that Susan and I have observed over the years in successful consultants is that your value as a consultant really hinges on your commitment to professional development. And I found that myself, that every time I've participate in a course, or I do some periodical what I call deep dives, where I've done deep research on a particular topic like executive transitions and organizational sustainability, that it had a huge impact on our business portfolio, and really kind of leveled up our income. So I can't say enough about the idea of continuing education, in addition to, yes, you do need to set aside some time for administration and of course marketing and selling the work. Let's talk about the roles that consultants play out there. So there's a whole spectrum of services that consultants or outside advisors provide to organizations. At one of the spectrum, we have what might be considered freelancers, people who kind of work almost as an extension of the staff in an organization, usually kind of doing task-based work, often billing by the hour. At the other end of the spectrum, we have what we would consider the strategic advisor. This is almost like the pure consulting, somebody that's going in and building a relationship with a client and really helping the client problem solve issues in their organization. And of course, in between, we have a whole lot of other different approaches. Interim executives, executive coaches, people who provide meeting facilitation and training, and then what we would call a process expert, which would be, like folks who facilitate strategic planning, or folks that go in and work with a client to help them develop an inside process, like, a better client management intake system or something along those lines. So the great news is that there's just lots of opportunities out there that, in fact, I think the more that we kind of enter into this gig economy, I think the more opportunities there are for consultants and outside advisors to, play roles in organizations and provide that kind of, flexible, just-in-time services to organizations. So I'm going to turn it back over to Susan, who is going to pick up from here and talk about consulting as a business.
Great, thanks, Don. So now we start getting into some of the nitty gritty, now that you understand some of the big picture pieces in terms of what your day will be like and what it means to be a consultant. It's really interesting. Don and I started talking not long ago about what it means to launch your consulting business. In other words, when are you actually in business? There's a lot of ways we could answer this. We came up with a formula that we'll try out on you and see what you think. It's a three-pronged formula, and essentially it means that you would have, number one, a client with a need, number two, a service you offer that meets that need, and then three, a fee that both you and the client can agree on. That's it. So a client, the service that you provide to meet their need, and the fees. Now, it seems simple, but I will say it becomes much more complex than you may think. There's many pieces that feed into this. You can see where this gets into a lot of your initial questions and comments about the barriers and fears around consulting. So we're going to go through these fairly quickly, just because of time constraints, but know that you will have this slide deck to refer back to, and we'll have our half hour or so for questions at the end. So we'll go through it fast just because there's a lot to cover, but we'll get to some of the specific questions you have on the outset. So let's start with the client with a need. Identifying your ideal client is really what we start thinking about when we're talking about marketing. So these are all pieces you'll need to consider. Now, the most important thing we'll say on this slide, it's important that you don't want to accept just any client. That can be very tempting at the beginning, but you don't want to let other people's needs define your business. Instead, be proactive and take some time to figure out these pieces for yourself. For instance, that first bullet, what exactly is the issue or problem or need that you are going to solve? And in what geographic area? Maybe there's a mission or service area you want to focus on, or a budget size, or any of these other pieces. Create your own set of corporate policies on these pieces. Do you want to deal with startups or more mature organizations? You can create this for yourself, treat yourself like the real corporation you are, and go through this list and try to stick to it as much as possible. Now, if you define some items here and you find that there isn't a market for them, do your own informal research and ask around. Ask relevant executives or other consultants about the potential marketplace for the ideal client that you defined, and ask if they've used consultants in this field recently. You may well need to expand from, say, a local to a regional footprint, or expand, say, from a focus on mental health to healthcare in general. The next piece of our formula is the service side of it. And we really encourage you, at least in the early stages, to lean into your existing strengths. Understand that you're going to have many things that you probably aspire to do as a consultant, but you initially want to look at things like your understanding of the sector you're in, the work experience and successes you have, your existing set of skills, and especially your relationships. Because look, it's all about the relationships that you have, and those are going to be your first entrees into a client pool. So the people who know you, trust you, are willing to hire you and refer you. It's as simple as that. My initial service area is the one that I still consult on the most, just because people knew of it then. So 20 years ago when I was in-house and I was doing securing foundation grants from large national funders, that's still a fair amount of the work I do now, because that's what I was known for and trusted to do. And it's a fair amount of my service work today. And finally, the F word, fees. There are 4 ways of billing fees, and it's pretty fair to say that most new consultants go with the first approach, which is time and materials. Why is that? It's the safest, because when you're charging for your time, being a daily or hourly rate, it's safe. You are not going to overbill or underbill. You're going to be getting a fair fee. There are lots of books and websites that allow you to help figure out that hourly fee. I wish we had the time to do that today. Don has developed a terrific spreadsheet around that. But it's worth saying that once you get past that initial phase, you'll go on to some of these other pieces, like a flat fee, for instance, which is also called a project fee. Let's say a particular project early on takes you 10 hours and you're charging $100 an hour. You charge $1,000, and then you get more efficient at doing that project. So over the course of a year or 2, you can do that same project in 7 hours. Well, you certainly don't want to charge $700 and have a lesser fee as you become a more experienced consultant. So you may move to a flat fee and say, that $1,000 fee was, nobody ever shirked at that, so I'll charge the $1,000 as a flat fee for this particular type of project. And that's where your efficiencies start really driving your business. I'll just say briefly these other pieces. A retainer is often a monthly fee that you'll get for a certain number of hours, and value-based is probably a more advanced approach, it's safe to say, because it's based on your knowledge of the marketplace and what a certain type of service will bear. Okay, so more on fees. Clients perceive price in different ways. And when I was a new consultant, I have to admit, I didn't give this as much thought as I probably should have. But your reputation certainly drives what you can charge. The risk involved does as well. Can the client be reasonably assured that this will be a successful engagement? And the way you answer that question comes via referrals, testimonials, and really examples that you can give of your success on similar projects. Prestige, believe it or not, is another real factor in this. Are you offering kind of the Kia or the Cadillac of consulting services? I have nothing against Kias, of course, but there's a market for everything. You can charge a higher fee depending on how exclusively you package your services, how many others offer those services, and the demand for them, of course. And then also the level and frequency of access that your clients get to you. And finally, it's worth saying that your competition clearly plays a role in this. It's important to know what your competition costs. And again, you can go around and ask your respected contacts in the field what they charge and what they pay in these various areas, and often get surprisingly candid answers. I'm going to give you a really quick and dirty launch plan with some of the things we've talked about here. Getting set up includes certainly seeing if the name for your business is available. Maybe you don't even need a name, you're just going to use your own given name. A legal structure, many new consultants use LLCs, but there are a few options there that you can talk to a lawyer about. And infrastructure, whether or not you want to hire people to help either with your accounting or your website, or even to subcontract with you on particular types of projects. But I would say that even though those are the more intimidating pieces sometimes, the first place to start is in this right-hand column and get a client. So defining that ideal customer, as we discussed earlier, that's a big piece of it. Defining your services and fees, crafting your pitch, what you would say to someone when faced with the possibility that you might get their business, or they were a potential client. It's an important thing to make sure it rolls off your tongue easily and you can say it with confidence. And then just start talking to people. Getting a client is really the best way to start. And if you begin with the last step in this list, terrific. That's a fabulous way to start your business. It's safe to say that the success formula here is really to do good work, to be diligent in your follow through, build and nurture your network. You know, your reputation is built, as we know, over years of good work, but it only takes sometimes one flop for that reputation to be ruined. So to be very diligent in all of these first three bullets is so important, so that we make sure that, again, we're being our authentic selves, doing good work, and making sure that the relationships we have are robust. The feeding your sales funnel is, you know, a more technical thing than we have time for today, but it's worth saying, if you're full for the next 6 months, you cannot, unfortunately, rest on your laurels. You need to be thinking about month 7. That is one of the keys to keeping your business running. And then, as Don mentioned earlier, keeping yourself growing professionally and personally, super important. It might feel like many of these are soft skills, but you may be getting the impression that's what consulting is about. Even if, say, you're an IT consultant, of course you will know your stuff. That's why you're getting into this field. But building trust with clients, being diligent with them, and with your own professional development, that is what will keep your business moving over time. So in a nutshell, we think you should just get started, iterate, learn, and evolve. I've been doing this for 17 years, and I feel like I'm always on the cusp of something new. A restless consultant is what I call myself. You know, we've gone through a lot today, and I'm excited to take some of your specific questions because we've covered so much. I just want to turn back to a second to something that Don said earlier, which is that we have this terrific bonus for those of you who have stayed on till the end. So Don, I'll let you talk about that and where to grab it.
Okay, thanks, Susan. So you're probably wondering about next steps, what you can do after this webinar. Obviously, we can only just touch on kind of the surface level of ideas in an hour. And so for those of you that are undecided yet, and you really are maybe uncertain, I heard some folks mentioned confidence, issues around confidence, where, you know, am I really ready to start a consulting practice? We have a free assessment that is available. If you just go to this link, and I think, Christine, you're going to put that into the chat rules so that folks can just click on it.
You got it.
Yeah. So if you go to that page, that page is going to take you to some workshop that we're going to be talking about in a moment here. But there's also on the right-hand side, you'll be able to click on a link and go get this PDF. It's a 2-page PDF that is a pretty thorough questionnaire, about 25 questions that we think are the top level questions to get started with a consulting business. And there's also a page of narrative that goes with it that kind of walks you through it. And of course, if you have any questions about it, you can reach out to either me or Susan. We're happy to talk with you about what you see as the results.
And I know questions continue to come in via the chat area. I do have a good number lined up, so I will try to get to as many as possible, but we probably won't get to them all, but I'll jump right in. Fees. Fees came up a few times. So both Linda and Holly raised in the chat that can nonprofits really afford consultants, and exactly how are they going to be able to pay the fees I need or want to charge? And a related question came in from Kaylin asking, and I know that, Susan, you touched upon this, that time and materials is a good starting point, but do you have a recommendation regarding when to use hourly rates and when to use per project rates?
Got it. Yeah.
Well,
go ahead, Don.
Well, so I think in terms of, let me turn it over to Susan to talk about the when do you use hourly rates versus project rates, because I think both of us use all of those approaches that we outlined earlier, value-based pricing, flat fees. Actually, I don't use retainers. I've never really, for a variety of reasons, I don't really want to bind myself to being on call like that, but I've used those other three approaches. So first of all, let's deal with the question about, how can nonprofits afford the fees? Well, here's, between Susan and I, 42 years of income. There's proof in the pudding here that it is indeed possible to find clients that can pay the fees, and it's surprising, what you learn when you learn how to sell yourself based on value. And I think that let me back up for a moment and say I think a lot of this stuff though is really a journey, and it's a journey that involves sometimes getting over our preconceived notions. For example, when I've been in the early 2000s, I was involved in this project at the Annie Casey Foundation on executive transitions, and they brought a number of thought leaders together, so on and so forth. Anyway, we started a company called Transition Guides. And when we started out, we thought we would, we thought we figured out the killer business model. We would get foundations to fund us to work with nonprofits that were going through executive transitions. And, sure, it made our projects easy to sell, but there was a huge hidden cost to that approach because, clients didn't value our work. We were working with a lot of organizations that were, very vulnerable, and so on and so forth. Long story short about that is that we gave that work up and focused only on organizations that were paying our fee directly, which was anywhere between $25,000 to about $65,000 to $75,000 for a project. So, it took a big gulp to make that change, but in fact, there are organizations out there that are willing to pay that. We had to be willing to, first of all, take that big gulp, and to let go of our preconceived notions about, we want to work with the small, struggling nonprofits. It almost killed us doing that. Now, I'm not saying that is the wrong attitude to have, to work with the small, struggling nonprofits. I think you can do that a little bit more successfully as a soloist. You can have that flexibility. But, when you're running a business, you've got 17 people that are depending on you for their livelihood. You have to get a little bit more rigid about your business model. So I say all that to say that there's a journey here of dialing things in. But rest assured, there are organizations out there that will pay if the value is there, if they can see the value. And I think that's really the place to focus on.
Great. And as for hourly versus project and other types of fees, honestly, I think when you're starting out, hourly can be the best because you're assured of making your hourly fee that you have calculated that you need. And frankly, the other options we discussed tend to come with confidence. But if you've worked in the sector for a while and you have worked with a lot of consultants, you might have a good idea of what the going rate is, and maybe even a confidence around your own ability to complete projects in a given amount of time. So I think that's the best way to go. Otherwise, there is somewhat of a food chain where you start hourly, then go to project-based, and then a lot of folks go to either retainers or value-based from there.
Great, great. Thank you both for.
Can I just say one thing about that though? I think that one parting piece of advice about fees is that it really needs to pass two tests. One test is the marketplace test. Do potential clients perceive enough value here to pay the fee that you're asking, and how does that square with the going rate? And if it's above the going rate, what do they perceive as the extra additional value? Are you providing additional services and so forth? And one of the things we're talking about in the course is, packaging your services in a way that you're disrupting, traditional models. And that also creates a freedom for you to have a little bit more flexibility on price. The second test is got to pass your business needs test, and that's one of the things that we focus on in the course. We actually walk folks through an exercise of building what we call building their hourly rates, their everything covered rate, and their just labor rate, so you know what you need to sustain your business when you're when you're talking with a client, and that what that gap is between what they're suggesting they have in a budget, the amount of time that you think it's going to take, and what that's going to cost. So those two tests, market test and your business needs test, and oftentimes consultants don't focus on that business needs test, and it's absolutely bedrock.
All right, great. Thank you both for that in-depth answer. One clarifying question that came in, I think this one's for Susan. I think this is a piece you spoke to, 10 or 10-minute coffee meetings. Could you just speak to that or clarify exactly what you meant by that?
Yeah, sure. And it's a good clarification. It's not 10-minute, but just 10. And in that, think about 10 people who either might purchase your services. This was under the idea of a simple business launch plan. So 10 people who could either hire you or connect you with people who could hire you, or are influencers in your field who may provide some good insights on, say, your fees, the market for your services, that sort of thing. Take those folks out to coffee and get some insights. And as Don mentioned, as one of the consulting traits, do a lot of listening. So bring lists of questions, hear what people have to say, and just be ready to adjust all of these early business plans that you're making based on what you're hearing from people in the marketplace.
Okay, great. I have some, I think will be kind of quick fire set of questions. One is business or professional insurance important? That came in from Megan and Dale and perhaps others.
Do you want to take that one, Don?
Sure. Well, so let's talk about there's two different things. There are two different types of insurance that I think are embedded in that question. One is business liability insurance, and yes, that's something that's important. We live in a litigious society, and so you want to make sure that that you're covered. And also, some clients will ask, particularly if they're government funded, may ask for what's called a certificate of insurance to prove that you have liability insurance, so that if something happens, like you're driving and you have an accident on business, that on their business dime, that somehow or another they're not drawn into it. So that's one thing. So yes, business liability insurance is an important piece to have. The other piece is professional liability. And I think, so first of all, I'm not a lawyer, so don't take this as legal advice, but I think that depends on, quite frankly, how risky the work is that you're doing. If you're doing advice on mergers and acquisitions, for example, or something, or organizational shutdowns, that could be a pretty risky environment, particularly if they're letting employees go, that kind of thing. So you might want to have professional liability. But if you're doing things that involve relatively low risk, like you're primarily doing training and leading workshops, that's a pretty low risk environment. But I think that the best advice is to talk with your insurance broker about it, and know that they're going to err on the side of over-insuring rather than under-insuring. But I think definitely business liability, professional liability, really check with your attorney would be a good place to start, to see how much risk exposure they think you have.
Okay, great. And we had question that came in a few times. How can you research whether there's really a market for your particular, what you have to offer as a consultant? So how do you kind of research those needs, research that market? What are your thoughts on that?
That's
When
one of
I
the points about the, that's one of the points about the 10 coffees. That, you know, that basically, you know, one of our messages is that is this is a journey, and it's a journey of learning and iteration. And so, you know, you venture out there with something and you get some feedback on it, and you know, that feedback can be in the form early on of, you know, doing kind of a reality check. For example, sitting down, first of all, figuring out who you're kind of getting a general sense of those three buckets that Susan talked about. You know, who's my ideal client? What's an issue, need, a problem, or desire that they have? What am I going to provide for that, and at what price? And then, you know, checking that out with your trusted colleagues in those 10, 12 coffees environment, and get some feedback on it. You know, what are people charging for that? Is this something that you would buy? You know, and if they're, you know, if you get some pretty negative feedback, or like, oh God, the market is overrun with that, then you might want to go back and rethink, you know, can you repackage that service and disrupt the traditional pricing model, or can you bring some, you know, some new value to it? For example, one of the things that I built my second business on was executive transitions. We disrupted the marketplace around executive search. We were able to provide a more comprehensive array of services in addition to executive search at typically at a lower price than traditional search firms. So we disrupted the service, we disrupted the price. So I think that's something that you can take a look at, but that's part of the, you know, the journeying process. But I think it begins with figuring out what it is that you could provide a value. What's that value package or that value proposition, or at least that initial value proposition look like, and then going out and talking with trusted colleagues about it and getting some realistic feedback. I'm sorry,
great.
Susan, I jumped in on that. Sorry.
No, that was a great answer.
All right, great. Thank you. All right, so other kind of theme that came in is we have people on the line who have a range of experience, a range of background, and how to kind of simply communicate that to prospective clients without it being kind of an overwhelming list. What are your thoughts on how to go about that?
Well, I'd say, again, remember that your main job at the beginning is to listen. And so first of all, you may choose that among all of your strengths, you're going to focus your consulting practice on just one or two types of services for simplicity's sake. I do think that when you have a specialty, that people tend to remember you more, because it's easier to equate that specialty to you than to a generalist. So for instance, even though I do a fair amount of fundraising broadly, people tend to remember me because I do a lot of work with national foundations. So admittedly, I will tend to get hired for that niche, and then people will eventually ask me to do other pieces of my strengths once I'm hired and they trust me. That trust factor really goes a long way. So I would encourage you to figure out which of those strengths you can hone in on at the beginning, and use those to talk with people about. But first, you'll want, again, to listen to what people are talking to you about. So maybe use those 10 coffees to ask the kind of questions that Don just mentioned, and figure out which of those areas is really the most in need in your marketplace. And you could go from there and expand your service list once you're in-house and trusted.
Okay, so maybe start with maybe a narrower focus that there's a real market for. That's great.
Yeah, can I just jump in on that to say one thing though, because I think I liken it going to the doctor. You know, when you go to the doctor, you sort of assume they have you know, a diploma, that they've been medically trained, you know, so forth. Why do you go there? You have a pain. And I think that's a lot of what goes on in consulting services is I think we approach it from the idea that we have this knowledge, these skills, and so forth. That doesn't translate into a value proposition. It only translates into a value proposition when you, first of all, take that that depth of knowledge that you have and those skills that you have, and apply it to a problem that a particular organization has or a need that they have. And so, clients don't buy you because of your background. Yes, they it's an important piece of credibility. They buy you because they've got a pain or they've got an itch that you can help them scratch. And so it all takes place over there. It really isn't about, what you're bringing, kind of the background that you're bringing to it. In the foreground, there's got to be a value proposition. That's what they're going to buy.
Okay, great. And speaking of buying versus giving things away for free, a question from Deborah was, is there a value to volunteering your expertise to develop a reputation early on, or is that viewed as giving away business and something negative?
I would say that if you feel like you are lacking in experience in a certain area, it's certainly something you could do to be able to start building some referrals. I would say that you can get in trouble for it later because as someone who does fundraising, I will say that my services have been requested for free more times than I'd like to count. And I think generally, if your clients are nonprofit sector clients, you will be asked to donate your services repeatedly. And you really need to figure out what, again, I go back to that word policy, what your particular policy will be on that. And at one point I did have a policy for myself where I would take on one pro bono project of limited scope per year. Honestly, at this point, I don't do that, or at least I certainly don't call it that. I will serve on boards and do other things where the commitment is outside of my fundraising, of my consulting scope, which may later involve some pieces, of course, of fundraising and board development, the kind of things that I do. But it can be a slippery slope in this field. So doing it early on for experience, it's really your call if you feel like you need it. But I would say that many people who have told us over time that that was what they planned to do, when we really delved into their own experience, they had plenty of it. And I think, frankly, it was more of a confidence issue. So I would encourage you to at least try to just get out there first and secure a paying client if that's what you ultimately want to do. And if you don't get the volume of clients you'd like immediately, maybe while you're doing some of the market research that we've talked about, maybe you'll take a pro bono client at that point to start building both your confidence and your referral base.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we have time for just one or two more questions. Do know that I did leave a link to a survey in the chat, which I welcome anyone who's on the line or please do provide your feedback. We very much appreciate it, both to get a sense of what makes a good webinar experience for you, as well as what topics you'd like to hear about in the future. So thank you for that feedback in advance. One question from Julie, and I think this is going to be relevant to pretty much anyone on the call, is the question was, what is the best way to thank people for referrals?
Just pick up the phone and call them. I think that's the best thing. So the interesting thing that if you really look at why people refer people to you, it makes them look good. And so you simply want to give them some feedback, sort of kind of, first of all, close the communication loop. Yes, I heard from so-and-so and I can't thank you enough for that. And, obviously you don't want to discuss the particulars that you have or the conversation that you've had with a prospective client, but, you can certainly let them know, gosh, this certainly feels like this is, solidly in my wheelhouse. Or conversely, you know what? I had an in-depth conversation with this person, And I thought that Michaela, my colleague Michaela, was a much more appropriate consultant because she has the cultural competency component or whatever it is, so that you're closing the loop with them and making them feel good that yes, this precious referral that I gave, or this person that I handed off, was handled appropriately and was advanced, and my my deposit here has been rewarded.
And that they're in good hands. You're reassuring them, right? Is what I'm saying, is that they're assured that you're in good hands. And I would say you get a lot of referrals in this business from other consultants. So another great thing you could do is refer people right back, assuming that those referrals were coming from a trustworthy, good source in the first place.
All right, great. Yeah, thank you so much. Janet and Sharon also in the chat area mentioned thank you cards have worked for them, and also taking people out to lunch. So certainly expressing it that way as well. Don, you were going to add something?
No, go ahead. I'm ready for another question.
Great. Great. We do have, I think, one last question, and the question is, any tips for introverts?
Ooh, I'll take that. Because I have to say, if you're getting at the networking piece, which maybe you are, you can let Christine know if that's. I find networking very difficult, and so I think there are ways. There's so many great books and tips these days for introverts around how to network, and you don't necessarily have to put yourself in a situation where you're in a big room full of people and feeling like you need to go out, having met 24 prospective clients that night. I will admit that I have probably operated my business over all of these years simply by talking to people who I already like and respect in my networks, and meeting people one-on-one for coffee or lunch. And it's a much more accessible way of operating. So there's really, and that's what I think Don and I meant when we talked about being your authentic self. It's really the whole consulting package will start coming together for you when you can figure out your own preferences and strengths and build your business around those.
Yeah, I think of the fact that you're talking to two introverts here is proof that that there's ways around this. I think the other thing that I've learned over the years is that so my natural tendency is to be an introvert, but there's so much if you've seen over the horizon and you know what's there, in building that next relationship, or that next level of contribution. Gosh, there's something that just compels you forward, even if you are an introvert, but it compels you forward on your own path. So you don't have to be the loudmouth at the table, the obnoxious consultant at the table. You can be the quiet, thoughtful, but penetrating person at the table. And that's probably the kind of clients that you want to draw to yourself, because those are the kinds of clients that you're going to be successful with. Leave the loudmouths to the loudmouths.
Very well said.
Yeah, and I'll add myself as the third introvert on the line. I'm sure there are many others listening in. Linda offered one other great piece of advice regarding networking. I think it applies to everybody, but including to introverts. Putting yourself in small situations, lots of video conferencing and phone meetings that allow you to interact with people all over the country, just like we are today. So thank you, all of you who attended today. And I know we didn't get to every question, so please keep in mind you can reach out to Susan by email. So I just want to thank you, Susan and Don, so much. On behalf of Foundation Center and our presenters, thank you again for joining us today, and have a fabulous rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Christine. Thanks to the Foundation Center.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Take care.